This is Talk of the Nation. I'm Neil Conan in Washington. Former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson spoke for many when he said that he started to read Das Kapital and gave up on page 2. Karl Marx's masterwork is forbiddingly long and dauntingly dense, a book cited more often than read, but unquestionably one of the more influential books in history. Known as the father of communism, the German philosopher and political economist needed more than 20 years to finish his critique of industrial capitalism, partly because he kept getting distracted by other projects like learning Russian or figuring out how electricity works. And while we think of his epic tome as a treatise on economics, Marx biographer Francis Wheen argues you could also consider it a comedy, a tragedy, or a Gothic horror story with as much satire as dialectic. Francis Wheen joins us from BBC Studios in London. Thanks very much for coming in.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm honoured to think that you're devoting this time to Karl Marx, a man who was written off some years ago as being no longer of any interest to anyone. It's rather amazing and slightly confirms my suspicion that perhaps there may be one or two things still worth considering and reading and thinking about in his work.
Well, apparently, that moment when everybody decided, there's a big fat book we don't have to read anymore, that was the moment when you got interested in Karl Marx.
Absolutely, yes. Well, I think partly just an instinctive thing. I always like to stick up for the underdog and the unfashionable cause. And when I wrote my biography of Karl Marx back in the 90s, it seemed to me that this was the most unpopular, unfashionable subject one could possibly choose to write about, because at the end of the Cold War, there was this idea put about, rather like Francis Fukuyama's end of history, that we'd now reached the end of history and that Karl Marx was dead and buried, as you said, in the rubble of the Berlin Wall, and no one need ever think about him again. And it seemed to me that actually he'd been buried long before that, flattened by all those dreadful Stalinist-era icons where, he was part of the Holy Trinity with Marx as a sort of godlike figure with a big white beard, and then Lenin as John the Baptist and Stalin as the Redeemer or the Messiah. He'd been buried for most of the 20th century by his self-styled disciples. And actually it seemed to me at the end of the Cold War and the breakup of 20th century style Marxism was a very good moment to dig him out and actually hear what he had to say, what he thought and read and did, rather than what was claimed on his behalf by various spokespersons who might not necessarily have been very reliable on the subject.
In fact, you write that Karl Marx had always been studied much more carefully and closely in the enemy camp in the West than he ever was in the communist camp.
Yes, I think that's right. He was used in the communist camp. But the very fact that where it all started in 1917 was in Russia, the Russian Revolution with Lenin and co., slightly shows how little they'd read or understood him, because one of Marx's recurring themes was that revolution, a proletarian revolution, as he put it, could only really break out once you'd reached an advanced stage of bourgeois industrial capitalism. And therefore, according to that theory, if it was going to start anywhere, it would be somewhere like Britain, the home of the Industrial Revolution, rather than in a sort of feudal peasant society like Russia. And so in order to get round this problem, the Russian revolutionaries had to do an awful lot of nimble footwork and ignoring large parts of what he'd said and actually distorting him in the most extraordinary way. Lenin was the first offender, but there were many thereafter. Basically creating a new sort of elite vanguard class of revolutionary intellectuals, which was absolutely against the whole nature of what Marx was saying, that the revolution, if there is to be one, must arise from the masses, from the people, from the workers, rather than from a handful of people like Lenin. So from the outset, it was taking a different direction, and certainly by the time the Gulag was created, Marx's favourite motto was De omnibus dubitandum. Everything must be questioned. Don't take anything for granted. Question everything, challenge everything, criticise everything, which I don't think was somehow the motto of Stalinist Russia. If he'd gone around saying De omnibus dubitandum, he would have been straight in the Labour camp.
Or any of the other countries that claim to be Marxist, as you describe it, from Albania to Zimbabwe.
Yes, exactly. The whole essence of Marxism, people sometimes say to me, would you call yourself a Marxist? And I say certainly not, because apart from anything else, it's meaningless. The word has been used in so many different 57 varieties that, if it covers everyone from Fidel Castro to Enver Hoxha to Kim Il-sung to goodness knows who, to various French theoreticians and academics, then it doesn't really mean very much. But insofar as Marxism means anything, I mean, in the spirit of Marx himself, it is a process, it's a method, a way of arguing, a way of looking at the world, of trying to understand the world, of criticising, of arguing. It's a continuing engagement. It's not sort of 10 commandments written on tablets of stone, but unfortunately that's exactly what it became.
We want to get listeners involved in the conversation. 800-989-8255. Email talk@npr.org. But I did want to ask you one question. And we think of Marx's work. Well, he has a lot of predictions in his work. Is the genius of his work rather more descriptive of his analysis of capitalism?
Yes, I think that would be a fair comment, actually. As a prophet, as a prophet sometimes he's remarkable. But there is a slight problem, which is the tension between, if you like, his intellect and his will. The famous phrase of another 20th century Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Or if you want to put it in plain English, be prepared for the worst, but hope for the best. But it's a bit more complex than that. And Marx, intellectually, I mean, as a student of capitalism and an analyst of it, absolutely understood what an extraordinarily powerful system it was. I mean, in the Communist Manifesto, the pamphlet he wrote back in 1848, he described it as having surpassed wonders far greater than the Egyptian pyramids or any other ancient wonders of the world, having torn aside all sorts of old feudal, sentimental social relations, absolutely ruthless and pitiless and remarkable. I mean, technologically remarkable in so many ways. So he was, he gave capitalism its due, and given the strength of that system, which he described very powerfully, he sort of knew that it wouldn't just keel over and die. On the other hand, he hoped it would, and so there is a slight conflict in his work when he'll give a long. I mean, actually, in Das Kapital, nobody ever seems to notice this, probably because they don't get beyond page 2. But at the very end of Volume 2, the last chapter of Volume 2, he actually gives a sort of schematic presentation, an economic model of a capitalist system which grows steadily and, in theory, can carry on indefinitely. But I think it is slightly buried right at the end of Volume 2 because, although he can see that's a possibility, he doesn't quite like to admit it. So there's rhetoric. I mean, from time to time, he comes out with his blood-curdling rhetoric about it creating its own grave diggers and all the rest of it.
Vampires, yes.
And there's an awful lot about vampires and horror stories and ghosts and phantoms and things. And quite right, too, actually, because the other part of Das Kapital, I mean, it's a very strange book. It's got so many different styles. But part of it is a kind of Dickensian portrait of mid-19th century capitalism, of horrific conditions in the factories with 9-year-old children working 13 hours a day and all this sort of thing. So you can see why it's a horror story and why he talks about vampires. But he does, I think also he does notice, this is why, one of the reasons why I think he is still worth reading and thinking about. He does notice, earlier than most champions of capitalism, that there is an inherent instability in the system. That
boom and bust, yeah.
It's boom and bust. I mean, the rhythm of it is boom and bust, like breathing in and breathing out, that it has to do that to continue and to grow, and that it's full of contradictions. Obviously, capitalism depends on competition, in theory, so competition is at the heart of it. But, of course, actually, if you get into the system and you want to be a successful capitalist, you do your utmost to destroy the competition. And so there is this, actually, the mid-20th century economist, free market economist, great hero to entrepreneurs, Joseph Schumpeter, coined the phrase creative destruction to describe how capitalism works. He said it's a system of creative destruction. And actually, when he wrote about that, he gave due tribute to Marx, said Marx was the first person to notice that it's creative and utterly destructive simultaneously, and that its creativity depends on this constant revolution, constantly destroying and creating anew, not just destroying your competitors, but destroying the methods that have been used in the past for making these products, new technology, new markets, breaking open all sorts of things, creating a global market, and also in the course of that, destroying all sorts of traditions and social relations. It's not just economic; it's about people's lives, the habits of their work and their play. All those get torn apart in order to create the new market.
Let's get a caller in, 800-989-8255. We'll begin with Donald. Donald with us from, where is that, Bernie in Texas?
Yes, sir, Bernie in Texas.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, I majored in the evolution of economic analysis in the early 70s, and I actually labored through a lot of Das Kapital. a side issue. I've recently turned my own political perspective on its head as I read a biography of John Kenneth Galbraith in liberal economics. And have you encountered any reaction lately, given the new, polarization of politics in this country, people becoming more cynical about the market economy, quote unquote? And I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you.
Okay, Donald, thank you.
Well, it is. I mean, at the same time as Marx was supposedly being buried around about 1990, the end of history and the triumph of capitalism, and the market. I mean, market fundamentalism really coming into its own. This new gospel: there is no alternative. It was within a very few years of that. I think about 1998, that George Soros, of all people, the billionaire speculator, wrote a book called The Crisis of Global Capitalism. And I remember about the same time, after we'd had the Asian financial crisis and then the Russian meltdown, there was a piece in the Financial Times in London headed Das Kapital Revisited. And only a few years earlier, we'd been told the market is supreme. I mean, it was a godlike status given to it. It was sort of invisible but omniscient and all the rest of it. And yet within a very few years, there were all these crises erupting all over the place. And even the beneficiaries of the system, the people who understood and played the system, like George Soros, were beginning to sound the alarm and say, this is getting out of control. We've created a monster here. If we're not careful, it's going to destroy itself and us at the same time. And it's amazing to me how quickly that happened. The market triumphalism began to be a bit tempered and muted by these warnings. I mean, I think Bill Gates has occasionally said vaguely similar things, not quite as apocalyptic as George Soros, but there has been this slight retreat from it, and a feeling that perhaps the market alone, absolutely unregulated and left to its own devices, may not be the best way to ensure stability and prosperity for all and forever.
We're talking about Francis Wheen's biography of Das Kapital, part of our series on books that changed the world.